Thank you guys so much for being with us today for Seeking Meaning Through a Latino Futurist Lens with Ruben Reyes Jr. Our event will start in just a second. We'll have a Q&A later on for any questions from the audience. Um, I just wanted to, I just wanted to welcome everyone. My name is Gustavo Alvarenga. I am a program assistant at the Black Mountain Institute and a creative writing MFA fiction student here at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas. Um, and I am so thrilled to have Ruben Reyes with us for this event, somebody that I admire greatly. I do just want to kind of give you guys a little bit of an idea of what we're doing today. We're going to get to hear from Ruben Reyes, read from his work, and we're going to have a conversation on identity through the speculative lens. Our conversation will be focused on his latest book, which is Archive of Unknown Universes, a truly beautiful book published by HarperCollins last year. It is a story that explores the Salvadoran Civil War, the Salvadoran diaspora, and queer identity told through two interlinked families across multiple timelines and blends historical fiction and the speculative. Before I do introduce our guest, though, I do want to allow some time to express gratitude to those who made today possible. Black Mountain Institute would like to thank its supporters, Beverly Rogers, Miriam Shearing, and the Rogers Foundation. A big thank you to Ruben for being with us today, and thank you to everyone in the audience for joining us. I would also like to invite you guys to join us on Tuesday, April 14th, for the spring 2026 edition of our Sandbox Reading. This is a reading series which features writers from MFA programs across the Southwest, including IAIA, New Mexico State, UC Riverside, and UNLV. Complete details are on our website at blackmountaininstitute.org. Furthermore, the University of Nevada would like to recognize and acknowledge and honor the indigenous communities of this region and recognize that the university is situated on the traditional homelands of the Nuwu Southern Paiute people. We offer gratitude for the land, for those who have stewarded it for generations, and for the opportunity to study, learn, work, and be in community with this land. We encourage everyone in this space to engage in continued learning about the indigenous peoples who work and live this land since time immemorial, including the Las Vegas Paiute tribe and the Mawapa Band of Paiutes. Now, I am so thrilled to introduce a writer who has created some absolutely stunning and beautiful stories. Ruben Reyes Jr. is the son of two Salvadoran immigrants and the author of the short story collection, There's a Rio Grande in Heaven, and his debut novel, Archive of Unknown Universes, as well as various essays and op-eds, which can be found in the New York Times, Slate, LitHub, and the Washington Post, among others. Ruben holds a degree from Harvard College and an MFA from the Iowa Writers Workshop. Please welcome Ruben Reyes Jr.
Hi, thanks for having me, and thank you all for making time in your busy days to be in community and to talk a little bit about this book and my writing. Yeah.
And Ruben, I understand you have a little excerpt you want to read for us today.
Yeah, I'll start with a reading. I'm gonna read from pretty late in the novel, actually. So before I do that, I'll kind of give you the top level pitch for the book, which is that this is a book that follows two families over alternate timelines of the Salvadoran Civil War, which kind of hinges on the life and death, or life or death of a guerrilla soldier. There's also a device in this book called the diffractor that lets you look at alternate versions of your life, to kind of answer the question, what if? But it's also a love story in many ways, and I wanted to write about romantic love in this book because I feel like it wasn't a main focus of my last book. Um, and so I'm going to read a section that talks about one of the many love stories in here between two guerrilla soldiers. So, 1979. They tracked their love in deaths. When Neto visits Managua for the first time, the government murders 11 students at a protest in broad daylight. Rafael lands in Ilopango in 1977, and just 25 miles away, a nightmare descends on Aguilares. A church is shot up, and three Jesuit priests are kidnapped, then disappeared. Every couple of months, with every letter Neto and Rafael send, a new death squad pops up. Finally, when they're in Havana in 1978, no one they know dies. They take it as a blessing, a good omen at last. Death, Raphael prays, will not trail them this time. He waits outside the airport until a red truck appears, the passenger door forced open. He half expects a rifle pointed right at his chest, but no, it's far less deadly than facing a gunman, but just as thrilling. There he is, full of life, aglow with the grin Raphael knows well. Neto. I've missed you, Bicho, Rafael says. Neto smiles. From anyone else's lips, the word would insult. So diminutive, unserious. Young child, tiny bug. Dropping from his lips, though, it rattles with tenderness. Rafael leans in, kisses him. Neto gives himself over, fighting to get closer, the stick shift digging into his ribs. With a hand on Rafael's biceps, he feels small. He wants to shrink down further, small enough to disappear underneath his lover's fingernails, but Rafael insists they begin the drive. All right, Neto relents. You're right. There's so much to see. Everything is green, Rafael says. The hillsides they drive by are undeniably beautiful, but when you grow up knowing beauty, it disappears unless it's taken away, destroyed, or renewed under a fresh set of eyes. Gorgeous, Raphael says. Just for you. The plants are glad you're here, Nipple says. They'll make it to the city eventually, but first a detour, a hideaway, a place for them to be alone after so many months apart. The truck veers off the highway into the shelter of trees shading an unpaved road. The forest conceals them, reaching down to tap on their windows, so when a spot of light appears down the road, signaling a clearing ahead, it serves as a lighthouse in the distance, guiding them toward their port. Neto and Rafael step out of the truck and toss off their shoes. They're on the edge of a lake. The shore opposite them is a thin line, barely visible, which gives the illusion of a grander body of water. A gulf or harbor or inlet, something larger and less self-contained. Raphael too feels larger than himself, as if he's pressing against the edges of his life, which keep growing with new possibilities. The revolution in Nicaragua succeeded, and now he's here, stripping out of his khakis and peeling a sweaty white tee off his back. Beside him, Neto does the same until he's down to his briefs. A sight to behold, a vision to store for the next time, a vision to store for the time they'll spend apart. The slope of his triceps, a trail of hair down his waistband, the birthmark on his shoulder that Raphael kisses like it's a bullseye. Why stop there? Neto asks, moving in closer. Raphael slips his fingers under Neto's elastic waistband and pulls him closer. Their lips touch. Raphael begins to lower the fabric. Neto surrenders to the kiss, but Raphael laughs, pushing him away. I'm not that easy, he says. Raphael runs into the lake, and once he's deep enough, swims towards its center. His strokes are strong, measured. Neto rushes the water, desperate to catch Raphael and cool the hard-on forming in his underwear. Raphael's arms are slick, but Neto grabs onto them anyway. The men kiss, a laugh forming on their lips. The bottom of the lake isn't visible. Where they hover is deep enough to masquerade as the ocean. Their legs paddle furiously, keeping their heads above water until Neto chokes on a mouthful. He lets go of Raphael, composes himself. When he reaches out again, their legs tangle. Treading water together is too difficult. Neto releases arms but stays near. The lovers tread circles around one another, never breaking eye contact. What a miracle that a lake as large and beautiful as this one is deserted. They're alone, truly alone, like they've only been a handful of times. This is what love should be, Neto thinks. Me and him, drifting in sync forever. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you so much for that. That was, I love the way that you phrased it, the life or death of Neto, which is a reference to one of the speculative devices that you use in the story. We'll get back to that, but I kind of wanted to actually start off with this sort of vague question, especially for our non-Salvadoran audience members. El Salvador, for better or worse, has been in the media lately. It's come to the forefront for various reasons, some good, some bad. And so I get the sense that the identity of who the Salvadoran really is getting distorted as a consequence. So I'm just curious, Ruben, to you, who is the Salvadoran?
Yeah, I mean that's a great question. I think fundamentally it's about, anyone that can really trace their origins to El Salvador and to the Isthmus. Um, and I think a really important part of my experience of being Salvadoran as someone born in California, right, with parents who migrated from El Salvador, is that it's an inherently kind of transnational community, right? Um, because of things like the Salvadoran Civil War, which is, what this book is largely about. Um, there's huge populations of Salvadorans living in the States, and also a link between people still living in El Salvador. Um, some of it's economic with remittances, some of it's cultural, some of it's personal and emotional. So to me, the Salvadoran is like anyone that originates in the country, whether they're here or there. Often we find that people, live life in some in between. Um, I think of my father who didn't have a super straightforward migration story, right? He migrated here when he was young, and then he went back, and then he came back, and he's lived here most of his adult life now. Um, but yeah, there's something about the in-betweenness and the being there and not there that I think characterizes El Salvador. Um, in a particular way compared to some other countries in Latin America. Um, does that kind of start to answer the question? Yeah.
There is that okay, so the sense of in betweenness is very familiar as a Salvadoran American myself. That sort of sense of not quite belonging to either side, right?
Yeah.
Um, I was brought here when I was 2 years old, so I don't have any memories of my like original life, right? Um, and the Salvadoran as an identity has been pretty invisible until recently, right? So,
Yeah.
and it's one that has many stories to tell, but it is steeped in crisis, either due to civil war, to trauma, or even the marginalization of queer groups because of just the country's like Catholic conservative roots, right? So as a consequence, the Salvadoran has struggled to find its way to reach the greater, literary consciousness in archives and in some of your other short stories, you've chosen the speculative futurist aesthetic to deliver the voice of a people whose history and identity is often shrouded. I was just wondering if you could talk to us about your choice in using this narrative style and what are maybe some of the benefits or even some of the costs of using this style, especially as it pertains to illuminating facets of identity.
Yeah, that's a great question, a very big question, one I think about a lot. And I think you're right that Salvadorans, and there's a lot of Scott. I mean, Arturo Arias wrote this book in like what, 2008 or 9, that's like kind of the one of the seminal books in Central American studies that basically says that Central Americans within even like the Latino context or the multicultural context in the US are invisible, right? Growing up in outside LA, like if you were visibly quote unquote Latino, people thought you were Mexican. And then to explain, it's an experience that lots of Salvadorans I think have where you're explaining what El Salvador is and being like, no, it's not part of Mexico. It's actually its own thing south of Mexico. And it's like this whole thing, which speaks to the invisibility. I think what I've been thinking about recently is that there's also this kind of hyper visibility, right, with Bukele, but also the quote unquote migration crisis. The kind of MS-13 as kind of this boogeyman the Trump administration has used during both of its reigns. And so there's this like weird like hyper visibility at times and also invisibility at times that I think is really interesting. But it all comes down to the fact that there's a lot being said about us, and a lot being misunderstood about us in the real life, in politics, and in public discourse. And for me, the speculative in fiction is a way of kind of cutting through that noise. Um, a lot of my work is about things that have been talked about by other people, but often by, white writers in a lot of the great writing and most known writing about the Salvadoran Civil War isn't by Salvadoran, it's by white journalists. Um, or kind of, narrow reporting around certain migration issues. And for me, it just creates, I mean, there's a real benefit to all that writing and that reporting, but it also creates some gaps. And for me, the speculative really lets me get to the heart of the issue, right? It lets me look at the systems and the histories and all the things that kind of inform the Salvadoran American experience, um, outside of the very narrow kind of stereotypes or limited understandings that some other forms have. Um, yeah, and I've often thought, when I'm writing a story or a new something, I'm like, okay, well, can I write a quiet, realist story about Salvadoran immigrants? Like, probably I could, but like, it feels like there's enough of those stories out there, and the speculative allows me to do something that feels a little fresh and new and more interesting. Um, so yeah, I think that's a kind of a convoluted answer, but yeah, I think it's like I'm always using the speculative to get to some truth. Um, and I think that's why it works for me as kind of a starting point for my fiction.
Yeah, and I absolutely love the speculative is you use it to cut through that noise because yeah,
Yeah.
right. There's a lot of there's a lot of unknowns, both to the Salvadoran and non-Salvadoran alike,
Yeah.
Uh, and so and one of you kind of alluded to it earlier when you said the life or death, right, of one of your characters, because one of the speculative elements that you use is well, it's technology, and you use it in like a subtle way. In this particular world, I mean, the world of these characters is very much the same as our world, but with the slight difference of this device that you use, called the diffractor, which for those who haven't read the book, Diffractor allows the users in the novel to see alternate versions of their lives play out before them. And it's also like a source of tension between the characters. Some who might rely too much on, as you put it in the book, it's false promises. I was just wondering if you could talk about how you navigate these tensions between the characters and possibly if you had any like real world parallels in mind as you were writing these scenes of like technological skepticism.
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think I, as a person, am pretty tech like skeptical, but at the same time, I'm like completely addicted to my phone. Right? Like I think both things are true. Can people hear me? Sorry, I'm not like, oh,
Oh,
okay.
sorry, I think we froze there.
Okay. I was just double checking.
Okay.
Um, what I was saying is that I'm tech skeptical, but I'm also like addicted to my phone, right? And so I know this kind of paradox in my own life. Um, and so when I was writing about the diffractor, I wanted it to be enticing, right? I wanted the characters to be believably interested in using it, but there to also be some kind of moral qualms. And I was thinking, my editor, who's kind of a genius, gave me a note early on in editing this that she was like, and this was in 2022, so the conversation was even different. But she was like, or 23 maybe. She was like, think of how we're talking about AI, right? Like, is there a parallel there? And that really much informed how I talked about the diffractor, because the parallel between those two things to me is like, over-promising by tech companies and also individuals feeling that this technology is going to be a silver bullet that's going to solve everything. And then that creates some really nice tension in the novel between these two characters who think about the technology in different ways, which is also tied to like more fundamental things about how they think about fate and circumstance. Um, but yeah, that's really like how I thought about the technology. All my work is always thinking about kind of our world and the politics of our world. The problem is then how do you like make the politics work for the characters and in the structure of the story and for all the other things that make up good fiction? Um, and that was the challenge here, right? It's like making it feel as like part of an inherent part of the novel and not just this like interesting side note about technology.
Right. And, I mean, the thing is that your characters, I mean, they just feel so alive, and there's just clearly so much care and attention that you've put into each one. So you mention in the back of the book, in your acknowledgments, that you took this research trip to El Salvador in 2018, which is the year that a lot of the book takes place in. Um, and you seem to parallel your character Anna, right? Taking this research trip to like kind of discover her past or a past of some sort. I'm just curious if you could kind of give us an insight as to this research trip that you took. Was the book inspired by the trip, or was the trip inspired by an idea for a book? And did you have a sense during that trip whether what shape this novel would take?
Yeah, all good questions. I mean, first of all, thank you for saying that the characters feel alive because actually writing character is so hard for me. It's like one of the hardest things actually. Um, and it's something that I have to really, really, really work on pretty actively. It doesn't, I don't know, for whatever reason, it's not something that comes naturally to me. Um, and so I appreciate that because yeah, it was a lot of work to try to make sure these characters felt like real people and not just kind of pawns that were helping me explore the bigger kind of thematic questions of the book. Um, but yeah, you're right. I think one of the things that makes them real is that I was able to pull from my experience. I heard forever ago someone say that like a first novel is always just like retreading some foundational either memories or traumas or something. Um, and that feels kind of to a degree true in this book too for me. Um, Anna and Luis are Harvard students in 2018 who are like pretty bookish and interested in history, which is exactly who I was. Um, and Anna does go on a research trip here that kind of has some parallels to a research trip I took in 2018. Um, that trip was honestly very loose. Like, I didn't totally know what I was doing. I had been doing some academic research as an undergrad through the Mellon Mays. I was a Mellon Mays undergraduate fellow, um, and I got some funding to do research to which would eventually inform my thesis. And so I was like, I'm going to go to El Salvador and I'm going to learn more about the Civil War because growing up, I didn't know anything specific about it. I vaguely knew it had happened, but it wasn't until I got to college and was studying it in the classroom that I was like, oh, this is like kind of the foundational um, thing for Salvadoran diaspora in the 20th century. It's like this really, I don't know, it was like a much more impactful thing that I ever realized in my day to day. And so I went to El Salvador and I did some stuff that Anna does, right? I went into this museum that had some archives and just kind of looked around. Some details, actually, there's a scene um, in the novel where two characters spend some time in a refugee camp in Honduras during the Civil War, and that was, a phenomenon that I found out about in those archives. I also got the chance to take some oral histories from some guerrilla soldiers who were pretty involved in the leftist movement. And that was weirdly through like a family connection, that I didn't even realize I had. My godmother's brother was pretty involved, and he was like my point of contact, and I got to talk to some of his comrades. Um, and that eventually informed I mean, like the fact that one of the guerrilla soldiers does forgeries, the fact that there was movement between El Salvador, Nicaragua, and Cuba, like that was informed by that trip. Um, and the wildest thing of all is that I didn't know that this was all gonna make its way into the novel. Because I was in a very different place as a writer then. I didn't even thought about writing a novel at that point. At least not a novel like this. I vaguely knew I wanted to write, but hadn't really studied it. It was very new. And it wasn't until probably a year or two later when I was at my MFA that I had this kind of idea for a book. And I was like, oh, you know what? It is going to rely on everything I learned about the Civil War. Um, and those details. But yeah, at the time I didn't. It wasn't like I was there to do research for a novel. It was actually the opposite. I was there to do research for a vague thesis. Um, and eventually I was like, okay, that was ultimately novel research, even before the novel existed as an idea. Yeah.
It's amazing because I recently got to hold a one of these forgeries that you write about in your story, like an actual forged document from like an ex-guerrilla fighter. So when I was
That's so
reading those
cool.
scenes, I was like, whoa, like the connection there was just like wild to me. Um, and kind of want to talk about a little bit about how um, so you have this really close connection with the character Anna, and
Hmm.
Anna and Luis, the boyfriend character, both have these kind of quibbles in their sort of persona about um, their experience at Harvard, but their experience within this this within assimilation, right? So I just want to kind of talk about assimilation because I think like as immigrants or the children of immigrants, we feel this great responsibility to blend in and go through the process of assimilation without realizing that what's actually happening to us is a violence on our own culture where we're stripped of our original selves. Assimilation then becomes synonymous with annihilation. And we end up with like these varying orbits to our own culture. Sometimes we
Yeah.
stray far away, but eventually I feel like that cultural gravity pulls us back in. So I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit about how you broach the subject of assimilation in your book through the speculative lens and how it takes shape within those characters.
Yeah, that's a great question too. Oh my God, all these questions are like right on. Um, you read the book. Oh my God. I had a writing teacher at Iowa, Kevin Brockmeyer, who used to say that like writers have their obsessions, and if you read enough of their work, you see that they return to the same central obsessions. Um, I think one of mine is this kind of question of assimilation, especially in the context of social mobility. It's a really interesting and fruitful kind of phenomenon, I think, both in my life as I've experienced it, but also for fiction because it just like, I don't know, it's like, it's a very rich like context for characters. Um, and so I think all my work is in some ways thinking about, what does it mean to be Salvadoran in the US, right? When you're told, that you have to be a certain way to be quote unquote American. Um, but like the culture that we grew up with is also very real and important to us. So like how do you kind of square those two things away? Um, I think in the novel, I mean, I don't know. I mean, I think honestly, most of this was just coming from like how I was thinking through this experience and the kind of uh the emotional things that are brought up, right? Like what does it mean to grow up without history because, in part because your parents lived through a civil war that your now home country and the country that you have a passport from, created that violence and was responsible for that violence. Like that is a hugely difficult question, and a very emotional one to address, right? And I think that's why that's one of the central questions of the novel, and that Anna and Luis have to kind of work through. And that was all coming from like my own experience of going through that process of trying to figure that out. Um, I also think it's why there was a point when I was writing this where I was like, oh God, another like campus novel or novel partially set at a campus and like writing about Harvard, I feel like is could be the boringest thing I could do. Like, I don't know. I was just kind of like in my head about some of that stuff. But ultimately I was like, no, this is actually good, not only because it's like I knew that setting and that experience, so it was easy to write about it with some kind of believability. Um, but also like Harvard for good or bad, was a very, very clear place where I was faced with the question of like, do I belong? How do I fit into the tradition of this country? Am I what people, you know, expect a Harvard student to be? It's like, I was thinking about assimilation a lot in that context. And so it was a very rich kind of setting for my characters too. Yeah. So I think that's also, I think it with that setting in particular, I was thinking about this question of assimilation a lot. Um, yeah, it's a really hard question to answer because it's
Yeah,
like I approach it from so many different ways and so many different angles. And it's also like one that I actively deal with as a person every day. So it's like I don't always know where I land on it. But yeah, yeah.
yeah. I mean, it's so interesting because uh, part of my sort of quibbles with my ideas on assimilation is that I didn't really have a negative view towards it until later on in life because
Right.
in our early life as Salvadorans, I don't think we know much about our history. And that's because our parents, our grandparents, uncles, aunts that grew up in that era, they didn't talk much about the history. They talked about
No.
food. They talked about the good things, right? But like what the country actually was and what was going on was
Yeah.
uh, was missing, and that's because there's a pervasiveness of silence, right? And
Yeah.
to many, silence is just a passive state of soundlessness. But to the Salvadoran, silence is an act inflicted upon our consciousness, either deliberately or unintentionally, and often it is an inherited trauma. The theme of silence permeates this book, and the word itself can be found on nearly every other page. And you even open the book with an epigraph by the Nicaraguense poet Daisy Zamora, which in 9 lines just gorgeously encapsulates the entire premise of the book. So I just love to hear more from you about what you think about this act of silence and how it informs your writing.
Yeah, I mean it's what I grew up in. It's like I mean maybe there's a line in the novel, it's something about like this idea that silence is my heritage is something that I've always thought about because I think it feels true the more I've learned about Salvadoran history. There's some great scholarship by the sociologist Lazy Abrego that makes a kind of a argument along these lines, which is that Salvadorans in the US grew up without a sense of their history and culture because their experiences as war victims in the 80s were denied by the United States, right? The United States was claiming it wasn't really funding a war there. And then very few asylum cases were approved. It's really like what, like 2% or something. Um, Everyone else was like told that they were they were coming as economic migrants, fleeing poverty, not fleeing a war. And her whole thing is that then means that people grow up with this silence. Um, I think also it's just like, how do you expect your family to like talk to you about some of the most traumatic things they've been through, right? Whether that's experiences of a war or migration, both two really traumatic things. And so I think it makes sense that Salvadoran American kids grow up without knowing much about El Salvador. Um, and this book is a lot about that and about breaking those silences. Um, but also the importance of breaking those silences, right? Because I think maybe going back to your assimilation questions, the reason it took me so long to understand what it meant for me to be Salvadoran in the way I do now was with a lot of research on my own, with a lot of coming across literature by other Salvadorans who had asked this question for themselves. It was like this very active process. Um, because how are you going to have a cultural identity without knowing about your culture beyond your own family, right? Um, and I think that's also why assimilation is really appealing, especially when you're young, right? And when even our communities are like, yeah, you should, make as much money as you can and like aspire to these kinds of things because that's what you do in America. Um, and I can't blame, my relatives for feeling that way and aspiring to that given everything they've been through. And I totally know where they're coming from. Um, but eventually you also learn that, like what you said, assimilation can be annihilation, right? Assimilation is really accepting these systems that ultimately hurt our communities, which is a theme that shows up, I think, in many of my stories, especially in the first book. Um, but yeah, and all this, stems from this silence, this kind of like foundational silence that I think characterizes a lot of Salvadoran um, American young people, especially. But probably in many ways, immigrants across the board, and the kids of immigrants. Um, yeah, it feels kind of like thinking about like silence as a theme feels very woo-woo a little bit, right? You're like, what does that mean? Like, what is that metaphor for? What does it mean? And like breaking your silence can feel kind of corny, but I do think that there's like a very tangible, you know, aspect to it, which is like writing fiction is like breaking the silence, learning your history is a way of breaking the silence. Um, and it all leads to a political consciousness, which I really believe is like a very practical thing for everyone to have. Um, yeah, it's a question. Like I think talk about obsessions. I think I'm gonna keep coming back to this idea of silence over and over in my work.
I mean, same here. It's just something so it, so I feel this great responsibility as a writer, as a Salvadoran American writer, in order for me to break through that silence, we have to dig into memory, right? And
Hmm.
so I wanted to talk about memory, especially the way in which you use mothers as vessels for collective memories in the story. You say in the book, grandmothers hold a family's stories, which is something that I think can be said about our mothers and our tias, and I think they're the ones who are always the most observant ones in the
Yeah.
family. Um, they're the ones who gather around and they gossip in hushed tones, right? And I can't help but think of a line from John Philip Santos's Places Left Unfinished at the Time of Creation, where he's talking about his great aunt. He says, like others of her generation, the present has lost its claim on her. Mostly she wanders disembodied through her 95 years as if they were interlocking chambers of an enormous shell of memories. And I think it's so especially ironic that the grandmother figure in your story and archives, Esperanza, is suffering from dementia. So
Yeah.
it's like, so those stories that grandmothers hold and the memories are slipping away into nothingness through her. And I'm just wondering if could you talk a little bit about how you navigate memory and the significance of memory in your stories? And I was maybe wondering if Esperanza is a metaphor for the lost memories of an entire country.
Yeah. I mean, to answer that last question first, I mean, I welcome that reading. I think it's a good one. I think uh so it's whenever you're writing a character, you're trying to be as specific as possible so they feel real, but sometimes when you get to that specificity, that's actually what makes it feel universal. It's like this very weird paradox that I've seen in fiction writing. And so I think Esperanza kind of playing this role, maybe metaphorically, um, speaks to that, right? That she's this very particular character with this particular disease that I'm pulling from my life. Basically, my grandmother had Alzheimer's and dementia. Um, but in the context of story, yeah, it takes this broader, kind of more significant metaphorical role too. Um, in general, memory is a really good topic for fiction, I think, because first it's um, debated and fragile and incomplete, right? Um, and yet so powerful. I think of the Lucille Clift. I'm gonna mess it up. I'm not. This is not a quote. It's like a paraphrase. But there's a Lucille Clifton poem where she talks about someone wanting her to remember their memories when she could only remember hers. And I think that is such a true statement about how we, interact with the past. And for fiction, when you want tension, when you want conflict, when you want relationships that go through changes, um, you know, differing relationships to the past is really just fruitful. In the context of this novel, that kind of falls on like along generational lines, right? For some people, memories or the past is this impossible thing to touch that they don't want to touch, that they feel safer running away from. For some of the younger characters, the past is this key to their identity and to their future and to understanding who they are, right? Um, and so, what does it mean when these generations approach the past and memory in these drastically different ways? It just creates a lot of cool, and beneficial tension for the book. Um, and then I also think there's something kind of like, and this is like the ethnic studies, cultural studies former scholar in me that's uh like national memory, right? Like all nations are built on this myth of how it came to be and what our values are and all these things. And that's largely tied to the history and how we understand our histories. And there's definitely some of that going on here too. Um, where the meaning of history or memories can be distorted over time. I mean, we see that in the US all the time, right? Like I've been thinking a lot about how, you know, in July we're going to be celebrating 250 years of this country, and the Trump administration has decided to do that in a very particular way by using history in a very particular, narrow, and oftentimes violent way, right? Um, Luckily, there are historians who've written about, this is not just a country of freedom and independence, but a country of failed promises. Um, and so I think there's a relationship too between history and memory and kind of political nation building that is really interesting to me, and is one of the concerns of the novel, more in the context of El Salvador than the US, but there are some parallels for sure.
Yeah, I love how you refer to memory as something to touch, right? Because
Yeah.
I mean that's what an archive is, right? It's a tangible form of memory. And so like
Yeah.
it just beautifully ties into like the whole theme of like what your book is all about. It's that I'm holding something that is allowing me to like, go through the recesses of those memories of like a people, you know?
Yeah, and I was thinking a lot about like different kinds of archives too, right? Because there's like the archive of all these documents that are quote unquote objective, right? That you can hold and that are stored in a museum somewhere. But our family memories, right? Or individuals' memories or stories that you inherit from your family, those are a kind of archive too. And I think this novel was a way of thinking about, you know, how do you use the personal or familiar archive when the official one is has gaps or is missing something? Um, and, memory is essential role in that. Memory as an archive is a again, it sounds kind of like what are you talking about? But it is like for fiction writing, I think a fruitful way to think about that issue.
Fine.
Yeah,
Um, I do, for our audience members, I do just want to uh, invite you to put questions in the chat. If you have questions for Ruben in a few minutes, we'll read some questions if you have them. I still have so many questions for you, Ruben, but I wanted to give our audience member a chance to maybe ask you something.
yeah,
So go ahead and put it in the chat. I will ask you one more question while we're waiting for those. Um, and it's this idea. I mean, in many ways, like our archives um, is a ghost story, right? It's like the ghosts of unrealized potentials of people and of nations, and the ghosts of yearning that we Salvadorans possess when it comes to dreaming of a better El Salvador. So you open and close the book with like a haunting, these letters between lovers, which leaves the reader with like this devastating sorrow. I was just wondering if you could talk a little more about how you incorporate like these figurative ghosts within your narrative.
yeah. I love that. I mean, I think that's I don't think I've thought about the book in that way, but I think it totally reads. And I know I like the idea of like places being haunted by former memories that you made there or violences or experiences you had there. I feel that like I go back to like I've been back to Cambridge a couple times since graduating, and I'm like, oh my God, like that's the bench where I had a little bit of a breakdown because of some class that was ruining my life, and there's where I got broken up with, and there, blah, blah, blah. So like places, are haunted in that way. And I think that's definitely in the novel. Um, but yeah, I mean, I think you said it perfectly. I think um, I'm interested in like the way that history uh, is present, right? The way that, you know, we inherit, like nothing is detached, like the present is not detached from the past, right? That's kind of a fundamental belief of my life and my writing. Um, and so pinpointing the kind of historical moments, that have these like long afterlives and kind of haunt people or families is really interesting to me. I think the letters, yeah, I've never thought of the letters as kind of a ghost, but they are, right? Because they continue to haunt this family. And they also allow the person who's died to stick around, which is the other thing a ghost does, right? Um,
Yeah.
so I don't know, that's really interesting. And also, I am like working on new stuff, and I'm trying to write for the first time a ghost story where there's an actual ghost in it. Um, and so this is helpful. I'm like, okay, I'm gonna think about this because that feels like I'm wondering what I have to do now if I want to make the ghost a literal thing and not just like a metaphorical thing in the story. Um, it's gonna be
Right.
both, obviously. But yeah. No, that's a good question.
Looks like we have a question from Danny Trujillo. How do you incorporate or choose where to place the repetition words, phrases, whole sections in your stories throughout the collection?
Ooh, that's a good question. So I think about it two ways. There's like repeated words that are just kind of coming out of a messy first draft, or it's just like my go-to word, and it's not doing anything. And those I try to actually trim back. That actually feels like important to honestly, and I'll be vulnerable with everyone right now. When I reread the published version of the book, sometimes I'm like, that word is too close to like the word music is on this page twice, and I don't love that, or something like that. That happens to me. And so I try trimming back those things that don't feel super intentional. Um, I think the times when I try to use repetition really meaningfully is more when I'm thinking about it the way poets think about it, I think, which is as a way of returning to an idea and also creating a certain rhythm that repetition does. And then think I'm drawn to repetition in that sense. Um, and so, yeah, I often find that when I'm doing intentionally, it's more about how does it sound, can I repeat a word or a phrase in a way that sounds beautiful in this paragraph, and in that way appealing, but also maybe drives home whatever the thematic
Right.
point underlying that word is. Um, yeah, I think the most kind of obvious version of this is the final story in my collection. Uh, has the title of the book actually. There's a Rio Grande in heaven as the kind of repeated phrase that kind of restarts the story, and then we can see an alternate version of that story. And that was really intentional. Um, so yeah, it's a good question. But basically, I try to be a poet about it when I can.
That's thank you so much for that. We have a question from Jade. Um, She says, "Thank you for sharing so many interesting and helpful insights. Question: What helped you most with building the speculative framework for your novel and making it feel real for you? Or perhaps another way to ask the question, what would you have told yourself at the beginning of this world building process if you were to jump back in time a few years?"
That's a great, very good and smart question. I think for the novel, that was actually one of the hardest things to figure out. And something that I worked on once my editor was involved with the process, because I had the idea of a split alternate history thing, right? Around the guerrilla soldier's life or death. And you could do that without a speculative device, right? You kind of just take it as the, concept of the book, and then you kind of like just, split it into those sections, like I do in the book. Um, the diffractor felt really important to me because it was a way of then kind of couching. It was like the frame, yeah, like you said, it was the frame for that kind of literary conceit. Um, the challenge was figuring out how to make it really feel built into the world and like it was affecting the characters or the plot in some way. Um, Instead of just like an interesting device that is in here because this is a book about alternate timelines. Um, and so I think if I had the foresight that I do now, I would have told myself like this needs to be much more built into the world rather than just an interesting like hypothetical technology. Um, as you mentioned earlier, ultimately the device is kind of what one of the things that kind of uh, gets in the way of Anna and Luis's relationship, right? It's kind of fundamental thing that they disagree on, which introduces a lot of tension to their story. I don't think it was so pronounced that division in the beginning. And that was one of the ways of building in the device. Um, and I'll say that, figuring how the speculative concept or element of my work fits into everything else is a main problem and like issue that I work through in my drafts. Um, because I always am interested in some kind of like technological or speculative concept. It's usually one of the first things I come to when I'm thinking of a new story, but that alone isn't a story, right? That's just a thing. And then it's like, okay, so how do you build a story around this thing so that it's, a true short story and not just a somewhat interesting drunk thought that you share with your friend at a bar, right? Like yeah. So.
Awesome. I do. You put it so beautifully well. Let me see. There's one more. It's not really a question, but I really love what Iram said. He says, not a question, but a quote I came across in my thesis research about archives from sociologist David F. Bell. Far from constituting a source from which one might recover a certain plenitude of memory, the vestiges of the past return to haunt the present, both as reminders of the past and as announcements of the future. And I just feel like this quote is perfect for uh, your mix of fiction plus the futurist aesthetic that we've been talking about. Do you maybe want to talk about your reactions to that a little bit?
No, I mean that sounds totally right. I think I took, you know, in college, I took at least one class that was all about archives and also the very specific problem of trying to like write history and study history um in places or about peoples where there are no archives or where the archives have been censored or destroyed or, not maintained, which coincidentally is like a lot of the most marginalized people, in any one country. Um, and so I was thinking a lot about like, what the archive offers and what it doesn't offer. I've also been thinking a lot about Saidiya Hartman's idea of it's called, oh my God, I always mess it up. I think it's called critical fabulations. But this idea that like if there is no archive, what can you do to fill in the gaps um, through kind of creative work? And I think that is also why I was drawn to historical fiction here, right? Because I don't want anyone to take, you know, the details of the war in this novel as a fact per se, but they are rooted in some truth, and I wanted it to be at least somewhat faithful to the time period. Um, and I think in some way, there's a way that fiction can also help us understand the history, right? If history is debated and written by the winners and subjective itself, fiction can help us understand it, I think, to a degree. I don't want to step on any historians' toes because I really respect them and their work too. Um, but yeah, no, I think it's a great quote, and I think a lot about, yeah, the impact of archives and the limits of archives too.
Yeah, that's so beautifully put together. I'm just in awe with this whole conversation because it's like things that I've just been wanting to talk about that I think it's hard to talk about when like there's a lot of context missing, right?
Yeah, totally.
It's I wish we had so much more time. I'm seeing if there's any more questions from our audience members. Uh, and we will post, yeah, we just posted a, link to Ruben's books. If you want to pick up he has two books, Archives of Unknown Universes, which came out last year. That is his debut novel. And then his first book, which is a short story collection called There is a Rio Grande in Heaven. Both are just stunning and beautiful, and I cannot recommend them enough. Um, I was wondering if maybe we could just end on a poetic note, if you might want to read just the poem that you opened up your book with. Um,
Yeah, I can read that. The
yeah,
Daisy Samora. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. I just think this poem and it comes back to this whole. just re-encapsulates the entire ethos of like silence and hauntings and what it feels like when you're part of a diaspora
Yeah.
that essentially has lost a lot of its history and has to do a lot of legwork. I mean, I know on my part and a lot of my Salvi brethren, we did a lot of legwork in awakening to that past. So
Yeah.
yeah, if you could take it away.
Totally. I think the funny thing, also the context for this one is that I had already started writing the novel and thinking through this concept when I came across this poem, but it spoke so perfectly to it that I was like, there's something really Central American. Like, I don't know, like maybe it's a Central American muse or something, um, because it really is right on. And that's why I wanted to use it as the epigraph. So, this is by Daisy Samara. It's called When We Return. When we return to our ancient land that we never knew, and we talk of all those things that never happened, we will walk holding children by the hand who have never existed. We'll listen to their voices and live that life we spoke of so often, but have never lived.
Thank you so much, Ruben. Yeah,
Yeah.
that listen to their voices and live that life we spoke of so often but have never lived because I always imagine growing up there is a ghost, there's like a ghost version or a diffractor version of myself that still lives in El Salvador
Yeah.
and knows perfect Spanish, or the Salvadoran caliche.
Yeah.
um,
Yeah.
and and never came to the U.S. for various reasons, and so this book with its diffractor device, I just even opened up that imagination just wildly, really. And I found myself incredibly emotional in many parts of this book. So I just want to thank you again from the bottom of my heart for this.
Yeah,
Um,
thank you. And it's so special to speak with other Salvies and especially Salvi writers. And, I'm nothing without the Salvi writers who I was reading, honestly, before I even became a writer. And so to be able to contribute back to that kind of rich tradition is really, really special. And I appreciate the chance to talk to you about this book and all the big Salvi thoughts and feelings that we deal with on a daily basis.
yeah, of course. I'm so excited about what the future holds and your future writings. So, just to kind of cap off, again, thank you so much, Ruben. Thank you for everyone for attending Seeking Meaning Through a Latino Futurist Lens. I do hope you got some insight to what seeking meaning and identity means today. And we do hope to see you at our next virtual event. Again, that's Tuesday, April 14th. It's the spring edition of the Sandbox, a Southwest Writers Exchange. It's a collaboration between four creative writing programs here in the Southwest. And, they'll be showcasing their writings. It's MFA students bringing forth, their Southwest writing. So it's usually Southwest themed. Um, we're here in the desert and it's a lovely region. So if you're never been out here, come visit. But more information about the event and the participants can be found at blackmountaininstitute.org. We do hope you guys have a great rest of your week. Have a great day.
Thank you all. Thanks again.